Okay, this will be lectures 4 and 5 combined into one lecture for the end of our Gaddis book. Let's see if I can find 4. Okay, start at the beginning of 4, I guess. So Gaddis, in the final chapters of his book, is describing the end of the Cold War system. And so the place to begin with the end of the Cold War is the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So one thing you have to keep in mind is that what the Cold War was this global conflict. And one of the things that began to become clear is that sort of the old markers of power were insufficient, right? So previously, the nations with the biggest military, the ability to project that military were the most powerful ones on the planet, and that was the status of real power, was how big your army or navy was and things like that. The problem here with the Cold War is that the two largest military powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were roughly evenly matched with a weapon that could not be used. Nuclear weapons were unusable because they were so large and powerful that they would destroy anything you sought to use them on. One of the ideas or one of the drives for war is that you conquer your neighbors and take their goods. Well, if you conquered your neighbor, you didn't want to go anywhere near it because it's going to be radioactive for the next 5,000 years, right? So this idea of military power being the sole determinant of international power and leverage was just not viable. And so in this lack of sort of systemic power, it allowed for intangibles such as individual leaders to have an enormous impact on how events play out. So this idea that both powers have enormous piles of nuclear weapons that neither one can use, it's kind of an absurd situation. And it's something that both powers, the United States and Soviet Union, had spent an extraordinary amount of money and effort to acquire. To what end was beginning to be an open question. But the United States and its power in nuclear weapons was only one dimension of its power, where for the Soviets, the nuclear weapons and military power in general were their sole marker of power. They lagged behind in every other marker. So we have to go back to détente. So in the early 1970s, this policy of détente, proposed first by the Nixon administration and continued through the 1970s, this idea of relaxing the tensions, right? As shared negotiations on issues that concern both. This loosening of Cold War tensions. So what Gaddis says is, the Cold War froze World War II in place. And so if you think back, or you want to take a look on the map that's on Blackboard, if you think back to those maps at the start of, that we looked at the start of Gaddis, talking about how Europe is divided and Berlin is divided, that's where the Soviet armies marched to and stopped with the conclusion of the war. And that how far they went is where this new border between the two worlds was established. So World War II, the results that right at the end of the war are frozen into place. You have the Soviet occupied side, and then you have the Allied forces of the British, French, and the United States. So that locks these spheres of influence into opposite sides, right? What détente does is it freezes the Cold War in place. So where the status was in the 1970s in terms of negotiation, the intent is that it's sort of, we've reached a pause, right? We're not going to try and overturn your things. You're not going to try and overturn our things. We're negotiating in good faith. We're setting limits to nuclear weapons with the SALT Treaty, right? So all these things are part of it. There's a problem though. Both sides have to be happy with the status quo. And if you broaden your perspective beyond just the Soviet Union, United States, well, a lot of places were locked into unpleasant circumstances and weren't too keen on it. So Poland, with the Cold War being frozen in place through détente, is still occupied by the Soviet Union, and the Poles weren't happy about it. So one of the challenges is this may have lessened tensions and been some measure of satisfactory status for the United States and the Soviet Union, but not for everybody. So that's one of the failures of détente. So another aspect is the détente, it grew in a time when there were negotiations that were comparatively easy. SALT I picks the low-hanging fruit, right? So the category of intercontinental ballistic missiles, a set number, that's comparable with whether or not to the Soviet or United States. There's some differences for what it's worth. Soviet missiles tended to be bigger, and their warheads tended to be bigger because their ability to be accurate was less than the United States. So they needed bigger weapons to make sure they hit a city and obliterated it. Whereas the United States was relying upon still very large missiles and very large nuclear weapons, but their ability to deliver them accurately meant that they didn't have to be as big. And for the technical terms, they talked about throw weight, but we don't have to worry about that, right? So SALT I is that low-hanging fruit, comparing missiles to missiles, pretty easy. SALT II is an effort that came to fruition in the Carter administration in the latter 1970s. And this is a much more difficult argument because it's not just comparing nuclear missiles, it's comparing air wings to tank divisions, right? So how do you make those comparisons? And submarine launched ballistic missiles compared to bombers, right? So these type of things are harder things to compare. And the United States, its ability in submarine launched ballistic missiles greatly outstripped the Soviets, whereas the Soviets had many more divisions of armor, right? So making those sort of comparisons much more difficult, and in the United States, people are pretty unhappy about it, right? That's one of the things that made SALT II so difficult, is that you're trying to compare apples to oranges and reach some sort of limiting agreement. It's not as easy. Another thing about that is that détente relies upon the idea that both sides, are willing to accept the other side's position. But the Soviets were unable to prevent themselves from trying to take advantage of opportunities that came along. So in the Third World and in what the arena known as the Middle East, in these places, the Soviets continually sought to expand their opportunities. So they invested money and arms to folks who were in rebellion in some third world states, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. They sought to leverage advantages they might be able to attain with client states in the Middle East. And so these were violating the spirit of détente, which was supposed to be, we're both going to be on our best behavior because we're negotiating a lessening of tensions. For the Soviets, too, a problem came in the form of Afghanistan, which was which at the time was seen as an assertion of Soviet strength, but we now know is actually the desperate attempt of a weak Soviet Union to keep control. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, that was the last straw for this sort of SALT II agreement. The Carter administration, which had been running into stiff headwinds of trying to negotiate this in the United States Senate to get the Senate to go along, and also to negotiate a satisfactory outcome to this SALT II agreement, decided that the Soviets were not honoring their agreements by nakedly invading Afghanistan. So they saw, at the time, it was seen as an assertion of Soviet strength, but the truth of the matter is, the Soviets were absolutely desperate. Afghanistan bordered the Soviet Union. There was a Soviet client state that was in power in Afghanistan. But the problem was that client state was unable to control the populace. And there's a book that came out before this book that Gaddis wrote called We Now Know. And it has some great discussion of the cable exchanges between the Soviets and their Afghan client, in which they're talking about, you need to go out and spread the message of Marxism. And he says, in effect, they're not interested in Marxism, but they're interested in Islam. And so I can't compete with this argument. These folks are not at all interested. And so the Soviets were fearful that if their client got overthrown on their border by an Islamic radical or rebel movement, I don't want to say radical, rebel movement, that would be a threat to the Soviet Union, because there were lots of Muslims under the control of the Soviet Union that were not in Afghanistan, but across the border into the Soviet Union proper. So this was seen as the best of a series of bad alternatives. What Gaddis says is that the Soviet behavior during the 1970s, during this détente period, was not really strategic. There wasn't any plan for their activity. So supporting rebels against the Portuguese in Angola, even though it was going to increase tensions with the United States on issues that were important to the Soviets, cutting the amount of money they were pouring like a fire hose into their weapons programs, any attempt to, anything that would lessen the necessity to do so would be good for the Soviet state. But they still operated in ways designed to increase the tensions, as Gaddis says, because they don't have a strategic plan. Their plan was to catch up to the United States, and they didn't know what else to do afterwards, because the Soviets were falling woefully behind, although that was not well appreciated by folks outside of the Soviet Union. In this sort of locked-in place, there are a series of new leaders who emerge, these new leaders are challenging the concept of this détente and Cold War notion. And they're not seeking to keep things on an even keel, which is what détente was seeking to achieve. They're trying to upend, in some cases, or change the system to benefit the constituents they represented. And so this is something that's going to upend this sort of stability, and it's the initiative of individuals who are operating in things that are not driven by the idea of keeping the Cold War at a low boil, let's say, right? So, so one of these new leaders is John Paul II, who's a Polish cardinal who's elevated to the papacy. This was unpleasant news for the Soviet Union, who controlled Poland, because one of the tenets of Marxism is that religion is the opiate of the masses. And so the Soviets were seeking to replace religion with faith in Marxist, Leninist thinking and communism, right? So again, if you think about the dictatorship of the proletariat, one of the I guess, pillars that they sit upon of legitimacy is that it's their task to educate the youth in the glory of this socialist communist system. And so Poland is occupied territory. It's been occupied since 1945. It's firmly in the Warsaw Pact. It has a government installed by the Soviets. It has Soviet soldiers who occupy it. The schooling has been centered around Marxist-Leninist teaching, and by the late 70s, right, you have a generation and more of people who have been raised in this communist system, and so the expectation is they're going to continue in this education journey of learning the glories of socialism and communism, and leaving behind these archaic notions of religion, right? That's the sort of plan and expectation of this whole effort to educate the youth about what the glory of the state under communism is. So they were none too happy that a Polish pope or a Polish cardinal was made the pope. And then they were even more unhappy when the pope wanted to tour Poland, right? Go back to his homeland as the pope. And so the communist government in Poland, even though their Soviet masters would have preferred otherwise, they had to let the Pope tour Poland. And when he toured Poland, this came as a shock to the Polish communist apparatus in Poland and the Soviet apparatus in Moscow. Because when the Pope came and toured Poland, there were enormous crowds who came out. And the people who were the most fervent, or appeared to be the most fervent, of the arrival of the Pope and followed him about were the young people. This was the exact opposite of what Soviet Marxist dogma said would be the case. They said that religion is what the elderly clung to, and when they die out, they'll be replaced with forward-thinking communist thinkers. But instead, almost the entire country turned out at various stops on the Pope's journey, and the Pope very circumspectly, but very clearly and directly said that, you know, we shall overcome communism, in effect. So the dynamic response to the Pope was a challenge to this system. In China, you have Mao's death in 1976, and then there was a period of time when you had a trioca of people who were ruling. Again, in the communist system, when there's a change in the political order, it doesn't come generally very smoothly, but eventually a new leader rose to the top, and his name is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, looking around China, talked about the errors of the Maoist system, which is a challenge on the same order that Khrushchev was promoting about Stalin's misdeeds back in 1956, or 1954, actually. So when Deng Xiaoping comes to power in the late 1970s, he looks around the China that is not in good economic health, and he begins to try and introduce a little capitalism into the system. This is going against the program that Mao had promoted for so many decades and the communist thought, right? Capitalism is a backward system, not a forward system. Capitalism is what you leave behind. That's what Mao was trying to, partly trying to do, is to jump from a peasant society to a modern socialist society in his great leap forward, as well as industrialization. So when Deng Xiaoping begins to introduce a little bit of capitalism, it shifts the journey of the Chinese communist state. He famously said, if a black cat and a white cat are hunting mice, who cares what color the cat is, as long as they can catch a mouse? And so that was an allegory that it doesn't matter if it's the communist system or the capitalist system, whatever helps the state is what is important. So Deng Xiaoping changes the trajectory of the communist Chinese state and tries to introduce a little bit of capitalism with the intent of improving the economic health of the state. In Britain, you have Margaret Thatcher, who comes to power. She's a conservative. The British state had a system of state control and involvement in the people's lives that was labeled socialism. Margaret Thatcher wants to replace those sort of socialist leanings with the free market capitalist system, and she's also a very hardliner on dealing with the Soviets. Right, so she's opposed to socialism at home and also socialism more broadly known as the communist system. In the United States, we have the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. That Gaddis says Reagan pursues the grand strategy of simplicity. That's one way to view Ronald Reagan's tenure as president, but what Gaddis is saying is that he doesn't have the sort of granular approach to the policies of the state. He sort of has a grand vision of how things should be. And the way that Reagan sees it is that the Soviet system is bad and evil to its citizens in the world and will be replaced, and we should try and help them replace it, is what he says. In Poland, you have the emergence of a labor leader by the name of Lech Walesa. Walesa is the head of the Solidarity movement. This began in the city of Gdansk. He was part of a union of port workers, and they began to form a union to promote the interests of the workers. Now, on one way, that doesn't seem terribly radical, except Poland is supposed to be the worker state where everything is geared to the workers. It is against the dogma of Marxist-Leninism that your workers have to form a union to lobby for workers' rights in the workers' paradise that is supposed to be Poland at the time. So solidarity begins amongst these Gdansk ship workers, and it spreads across the nation of Poland, and it's not just a vision of workers' rights, it's a vision of democracy and liberty and freedom, right? So these are all individual leaders who charted a different path, which is upending or causing a lot of turmoil inside this system of détente. So a little bit more about Ronald Reagan. So Reagan, he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And Reagan has this idea that the détente is a failed policy because all the people who are locked in this unjust system have no opportunity to get out, and it should be the business of the United States to help them achieve independence and freedom. So the Soviet, allowing the Soviets to maintain their control is a wrong-headed policy, according to Reagan, because it violates the freedoms of all these folks, and because the Soviet system relies upon terror to maintain itself in control. So Reagan wants, with the failure of SALT II, which is about limiting nuclear weapons, Reagan wants to start rolling them back. So he proposes a program known as START, which is Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. So instead of setting a cap, he said we should work to get rid of these things. He also proposed abruptly, and much to the surprise of his advisors, he proposed that the United States should build something he called SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative, which was derisively called Star Wars, and that's the name that stuck. And it's an idea that the United States would build an anti-missile shield to shoot down Soviet nuclear weapons. And he also promised that if the system was created and worked and effective, that he would give it to the Soviets as a gift, right? So Reagan's ideas are about rolling back the Soviet Empire and undoing this business of SALT and moving client states out from under Soviet control. That's sort of what his vision is, and which he sees détente as an impediment, not as an assistance. One of the things that Reagan was seeking to do was that he was hoping to reach some sort of negotiated settlement and process to do this peacefully. But he found when he was elected president that the Soviet leadership was unwilling or unable to meet and speak with him. Part of the reason is because the Soviet Union's leadership was excessively old. There was a unofficial rule that in order to be the Soviet premier or high in the Soviet hierarchy of the party rule, you had to be a veteran of the Communist Revolution in 1917. Well, when you're getting up into the 1980s, that means whoever was part of that Communist Revolution is very old. And when Reagan came to power, the Soviet premier was a man by the name of Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev had rose to power in the 1960s after ousting his opponents after removing Khrushchev. So Brezhnev as premier had been premier from the mid-1960s now to 1980, and he was very old and very sick. So there was very little initiative out of the Soviets on this issue because Brezhnev was practically incapacitated. And then Brezhnev died, presumably of liver cancer, but that's just the best guess. So upon Brezhnev's death, there was a power struggle in which a new person popped up, a man by the name of Yuri Andropov. And Andropov was the former head of the KGB, and he came to power, and he was asserting power over the Soviet state. There were hopeful ideas that in the West that he would be someone that the West could negotiate with, but I guess they weren't paying attention to the fact that he was a former head of the KGB, not known for its liberal tendencies. So Andropov tightened his control, but he took a sort of antagonistic position towards the Reagan administration and the idea of negotiations. And then Andropov took ill. He died of liver cancer, and a third person was propped up. The premier's name was, I think it's Anatoly Cheryenkov. I know it's Cheryenkov. So Cheryenkov becomes the premier, and I say this only partially facetiously. I don't think I ever saw Cheryenkov talk, and as far as I know, he could have been a wax doll, because he was old and largely incapacitated. I've seen footage of him waving at Soviet parades. In fact, today, when I'm recording this, May 1st, is known as May Day in the Soviet Union, and it's a large parade time. He was premier, and then he died. Right, so within 3 years, the first 3 years of the Reagan administration, they had 3 separate Soviet premiers. So there's a lot of turmoil. The Soviets were acutely aware of the desperate straits they were in, and they were also acutely aware that they could not continue to put up old, decrepit men to run the government. So they, the Politburo appointed a younger, dynamic leader by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a young leader. He was in his 50s, and he was very clear-eyed about the Soviet position. He had worked his way up as a technocrat within the Soviet system, so he understood that there were a lot of inefficiencies and corruption and failures in the Soviet system. And so when he came to power, he wanted to change things, right? So the thing to keep in mind is Gorbachev is not trying to upend the system. That is not his goal. He wanted to create what he called socialism with a human face, which was a benign, more benign state that was going to serve the needs of its constituents, its people more effectively, and that the people would embrace the government. That's what he meant by socialism with a human face. And so in order to make the Soviet system work more effectively, he called for a policy known as glasnost. Glasnost means openness, and it's openness to voice criticism. In the final film, you'll see, in the beginning parts of this, you'll see Gorbachev going in to speak to workers in a factory. And so here's what Gorbachev meant by glasnost. I can't help this system do better unless you tell me what the problems are. So I need you to tell me what is going wrong in your district, in your factory, in your town, and then I can take steps to fix it. So he went into factories and said, this factory is supposed to produce 200 tractors a month. You're only producing 5. Why is that the case, right? And so he'd go in and collect the workers and ask them that, and they'd hem and haw and shuffle, and they'd say, well, the foreman is a drunk, and so he spends all his time hammered in his office, so nobody's overseeing the floor. And the director is stealing the parts and selling them on the black market, so we don't have the equipment or the raw material to make tractors, right? And so Gorbachev would say, okay, thank you for telling me. He would fire the director, he'd fire the foreman, and then he'd go to the workers, tell me who should be the foreman, tell me who should be the director. This is radical action in the Soviet Union, because one of the things about the Soviet system is it's supposed to be infallible, right? This is the system that is a logical progression of the science of economic formation. And so it's an infallible system. So you can't criticize it. So criticism was something that literally cost people their lives. To voice any sort of criticism against the state, you could be imprisoned or executed for such things. So of course, people are unlikely to criticize, right? So Gorbachev is trying to reverse that by saying, I need you to criticize what the problems are because I can't fix them until they're identified, right? So that's glasnost. The other thing that Gorbachev wanted to introduce was the policy known as perestroika. Perestroika is a restructuring of the economy and society to introduce a little bit of capitalism, right? This too is, as we see with the case of China, this is opposite of what the entire structure of it is. It's supposed to be a worker's paradise. There's not supposed to be private property. So what Gorbachev wants to do is to say, okay, so you farmers are collectively working these fields and you're producing grain for the state, right? That is what you do. You will continue to produce grain for the state, but we're going to give you a little bit of this communal land, a little bit of property where you can make your own decisions about what you want to grow. If you want to grow more wheat there and sell it yourself, that's fine. If you want to grow daffodils and sell daffodils in the market, that's fine, right? Whatever you want to do with that individual plot. The reason why Gorbachev was trying to introduce a little capitalism is because the Soviet system was so inefficient and corrupt that it couldn't feed itself. The area of the Soviet Union, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union is larger than this Midwest section of the United States, which is our grain growing area. And yet, despite the fact that it's significantly larger, the Soviets were unable to produce enough food to feed themselves, and in fact had been importing grain from the United States since the early 1970s. The United States was producing so much grain that we pay people not to grow grain, right? That policy that began, as we saw during the Great Depression, is continued in some fashion even unto the present day. Farmers still get money not to grow stuff on their property in order to serve as a price support. So you have Gorbachev is seeking to change the system. And I want to emphasize again, he's not seeking to overturn the system, right? So with Gorbachev, Reagan now has a partner to start negotiating, right? And so they meet in some negotiations, Reykjavik, a few other places where they're seeking to remove nuclear weapons, right? And so as we work through the second years or second term of Ronald Reagan, there's a lot of changes going on in this, the Soviet Union that is starting to radiate out to the occupied states. So this brings us to 1989. I'm going to cover this briefly because this is what a lot of the film has to talk about that you'll view next. So 1989 is a triumph of things unseen. And so I want to emphasize that if anybody ever tells you they saw the end of the Cold War coming, they're lying to you because nobody saw things unraveling the way they did, right? The first place that this, well, I should take a step back. In Poland in 1980, the Solidarity movement generated a lot of pressure on the Polish government. And there was a lot of pressure on the Polish government from the Soviet government as well, who said, you need to stamp out this emerging dissent before it becomes a rebellion, right? And so you need to stamp it out, or else we're going to have to bring in Soviet tanks as we did in Prague in '68 and Hungary in '56. So the Polish government was under a lot of pressure. So they cracked down, declaring martial law, arresting Solidarity leadership, including Lech Walesa, and breaking up demonstrations and seeking to break down this emergent movement against the Polish communist state. So Poland was under harsh martial law, and so many of the people who were agitating for some sort of changes were in prison. In Hungary, also an occupied Soviet state, the Hungarians are in desperate straits, and they have a new leader who is trying to take some steps to change things. And he proposes creating what is called a goulash economy, which is traditional Marxist Soviet centralized control processes, but also mixing in a little bit of capitalism, right? So this goulash economy is because Hungary is bankrupt, their debts are enormous, their productivity is low, and so they're seeking to meld in a little bit of capitalism. And also, they're also removing some of this oppressive government control on the populace, right? So these are events that are going on in Hungary, and they're alarming other members of the Warsaw Pact because they fear that changes in Hungary will spark the demand for changes in other places like Romania or Czechoslovakia, right? Or East Germany. Poland, after imprisoning its Solidarity leadership and many citizens, begins to release some of these folks. And Poland, again, is racked by these pressures. And so the government under Jaroleski is under incredible pressure because they're indebted, in desperate economic straits as well. The populace is resistant, and so Jaroleski decides he's going to allow an election that he hopes that's going to validate socialist control. It was a miscalculation because he released many of the Solidarity members who ran for the Polish Senate. And the Polish Senate, 99 out of 100 districts returned a Solidarity member. So it was a direct challenge to this communist system. When the people were given a free vote, they wanted to vote out the Soviet-controlled government. So Poland is also agitating for change. In China, there's a movement against the oppressive rule of the state. Centered around students who set up shop on Tiananmen Square. They're protesting the oppression of the communist government, and they're wanting the right to have a say in their officials through elections, and they want to open up freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so there's a large group of folks, many of them young student leaders, college students, and they're generating support for their views. And they're centered on Tiananmen Square. They're occupying Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is where Mao lays in state, right? So Mao's tomb is right there. So this is a challenge to the communist system. In China, there was a debate at the higher levels about what they should do. The hardliners won out. As we saw with strikers at Carnegie's plant in Pennsylvania, where Henry Frick went to the governor and asked for the Pennsylvania National Guard to help him. In China, the Chinese hardliners went to the military to break up this demonstration through violence, as you will see in the film. And in much the same fashion, I don't think they studied the tactics of labor owners against labor in Homestead, but the Chinese government brought in their regular units from the countryside because they didn't think the Beijing troops would shoot the student protesters. The troops they did bring in had no compunction about shooting the student protesters, and so they forcibly and violently broke up the demonstration, exceedingly large demonstration in Tiananmen Square, by shooting a lot of the protesters, and you'll see some of that footage in the film. In Germany, Germany is sort of the sharpest point of this dispute, right? Germany is cut in half by a wall designed to keep East German citizens in, and the capital city of Berlin is cut in half. And so in East Germany, there was a lot of pressure for people who wanted to travel, again, as you'll see in the film. And they first were seeking to escape East Germany by going to Hungary on vacation, where they then besieged the German embassy, which granted them free passage to West Germany. So this desire to get out of East Germany had continued, and the German government was under enormous pressure. What changed this time in 1989 was that, whereas before, when there was rebellion against the government, the communist government could reach out for help or had help forced upon them by the Soviets. This time was different. It's different for two reasons. Well, two reasons, I think, and I'll give you the reason, the other reason that is offered. Gorbachev says that he decided that he believed in the politics of love, and that they should not send Soviet tanks to crush down the will of the people in their own country. That's what Gorbachev says. Running people over with tanks is enormously expensive. The necessity of keeping firm control over these territories through the use of terror is an all-consuming occupation. And the Soviet Union was broke. They were in desperate circumstances, so they could not afford to run people over with tanks. That's part of the reason why they put the pressure on Yaroslavl to crack down on Poland in 1980, because it was an open question whether or not the Soviets could successfully reestablish control through the use of their tanks in Poland. The other thing is that there were so many people who were joining these demonstrations that it forced the people in the East German military to decide whether or not and how many people they were going to shoot, because the demonstrations were so large. And so, as you'll see in the film, the actual announcement that the border between East and West Berlin was open was made by mistake. But what made it reality was that all the people rushed to that border to go through. And faced with the overwhelming numbers and a lack of a clear directive and a lack of will to shoot all these people, the East German soldiers at the border let these folks through, and then the whole system unraveled. So in dramatic fashion, in the fall of 1989, that frozen World War II world became unfrozen, and Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe unraveled. Amazingly and quickly, in short order, Germany was set on a path for unification. The states of Eastern Europe largely dissolved their communist governments peacefully. Only in Romania was there some measure of violence. And the whole empire the Soviets had created with the conclusion of World War II unraveled. And then, as was predictable and unstoppable, that dissatisfaction rolled home to the Soviet Union. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were states that Stalin had stolen with the onset of World War II. In addition to invading Eastern Poland, he also invaded the states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. They asserted they wanted their own governments, and they wanted Soviets out. So the Soviets were forced to leave those places, and then the discontent came home, and the Soviet Union dissolved December 25th, 1991. So in remarkably short order and amazingly with relatively peaceful trajectories, the whole Soviet system unraveled. Which brings us to his epilogue, Gaddis's epilogue, the conclusion. So what can we say about this Cold War? Well, the Cold War is a departure from determinism, right? The Marxist interpretation is that communism is inevitable. The feudal system gave way to the capitalist system, which would give way to socialist system, which would be replaced by a pure communist system. Right? This is inevitable. There's the tides of history are moving that way, and they cannot be stopped. Well, the Cold War showed this deterministic approach is not a reality. It's not a scientific fact. Cold War also marked the end of hot wars between the great powers. Right, the story of the great powers since before Babylonia was that these great powers rise and come in conflict with other powers and usurp those previous empires to establish their own. Right, and so this had been clearly the case in Europe with the emergence of the German Empire opposing the French Empire, with the Russian Empire on its border, and the British Empire seeking to resist it. The great powers had gone into titanic competition and warfare in World War I, known as the Great War, until World War II came along, and then it was downgraded to World War I because that conflict was even larger, right? After World War II, you have two enormous military great powers, but they don't come into conflict because their power is such that everything would be destroyed. So the resolution to conflict between great powers is not military, right? The Soviet Union dissolved from within peacefully. It wasn't because it was invaded by the United States and the West. War is seen as a health hazard. The conflicts had gotten so large that even the victors were exhausted and weakened afterwards. So nation states who go to war, even the victors, end up losing because they are so weakened. So warfare is seen as not a viable method of pursuing your nation's aims. Military strength is no longer the marker of power. The Soviets were, in some categories, even more powerful than any other nation on the planet, but was for sure the number two powerful nation on the planet. They were the superpower of the Soviet Union. There were two, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, although its enormous military existed, although the power it held at its fingertips and its nuclear weapons remained, the empire dissolved rapidly, peacefully, right? The Cold War, this is written in a much more optimistic time, I should say, leads to the discrediting of dictators, right? The Marxist system, the dictatorship of the proletariat, totalitarian governments, as the United States referred to them, to link fascist and communist governments into one basket. This system had failed. Marxism, socialism under the Marxist method had failed clearly and objectively. They had been unable to feed their own citizens. They were woefully behind in new markers of power, the marker of innovation and technology. I'll give you a simple example. Dictatorship and terror work for doing certain things. You can make somebody dig a ditch at the point of a bayonet, but it's enormously difficult to make somebody write better software code at the point of a bayonet because you can't tell what's going on in their brain, right? So the Soviet Union had fallen further and further behind. They had to resort to stealing the technology of the West in order to make their systems run because they lacked the ability to continue to innovate and keep up, right? So the capitalist system had proven to be superior in this global competition. It also led to the globalization of democracy. Again, as I said, this is written in a little bit more optimistic time. What prompted the destruction of the Soviet Empire? The fact that its citizens wanted a different system, exactly as Kennan had predicted. Okay, so that's your setup for the final film, which I will post. It's part of the Cold War series done by TBS, CNN. It's the Turner Broadcast System. It's a fantastic series, and you're going to watch the episode when the wall comes down. So it's going to cover some of the putting the wall up, and then the wall coming down and the unraveling of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe.